Hello everybody and welcome back to the Sanctuary. I'm Professor C and we're going to continue our study of A&P. Specifically, I'll be going through the next part of the integument system by talking about the dermis and the hypodermis. So, let's get to it. Okay, so in our last talk, we looked at the very top of the skin block and a layer known as the epidermis. In this talk, we will deal with the rest of it. We will deal with the biggest part of it, known as the dermis, and the jelly bean layer underneath it, known as the hypodermis. So let's get in. It is made of connective tissue. Remember the epithelium, the epidermis was made of epithelial tissue. This is made of connective tissue. Lots of different types of fibers as we find in connective tissue, like collagens and elastins, fibroblasts making the fibers, macrophages, remember the white blood cells that walk around eating foreign things like bacteria and so forth, adipocytes, that would be fat cells, nerves, glands, hair, lots of things. Remember the epidermis, we just found layers of the epidermis. There wasn't anything there. The cells were so tightly packed we didn't have room for anything else. So two main layers of the dermis. Remember there are 5 layers of the epidermis, corny, loosey, granny, spiny, and base. Let's check out these two. And again, remember the line I drew here that was the dividor between the epidermis and the dermis. And we call the bumps the dermal papillae. And that is one of the layers. It's called the papillary layer. We're going to define this a little bit more in a better picture. But this really thin, bumpy part of the dermis is called papillary because that's where we find the dermal papillae. The rest of it, the rest of the dermis, is called reticular, the reticular layer. It's a lot thicker. It's about 80% the thickness of the dermis. So let's look at these more closely. Okay, a really nice close-up of a skin block, and this time we're taking the epidermis, which I'll label over here with an E, and we're peeling it off so we can see underneath it the dermal papillae. So I'll just put the pap here so you can see the bumps. And again, it looks like one of those egg crate mattresses. And I'll put pap over on this side too because it's showing the dermal papillae there as well. Now remember, the top part of the dermis is called the papillary layer because that's where we find the papillae. And the bigger, thicker portion is known as the reticular layer. And I'll just label it like that. So notice there are some other things here too. In the papillary layer, we see some blood vessels. And we also see a little, what looks like a long yellow balloon that's up in the dermal papillae. And this is a thing called a corpuscle. I'll write that right here. A corpuscle. And this is a particular one called a Meissner's corpuscle. A Meissner's corpuscle. And it is meant for a light touch. And it might make sense for that because it's way up at top. So you would feel like gentle touches, caresses, something like that would be picked up by a Meissner's corpuscle. It's a nervous structure, and it would send the signal down further so it could be interpreted by the brain and so forth. So we do find some structures here up in the papillary layer. So even though the papillary layer on most of the images looks really thin and you just see the bumps, 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 there are some things embedded here. So it is primarily areolar tissue or loose connective tissue. We find the papillae, which we've seen on a couple of slides now. The Meissner's corpuscles, again, meant for light or discrete touch. Those are the two terms you see on the tests all the time, light touch or discrete touch. And those blood vessels are called vascular plexuses, a very fancy name. A plexus is a tangle of cords, and so the cords here are blood vessels, so we call them vascular plexuses. Okay, a little side note on fingerprints. If you think about those bumps, those dermal papillae, right? Let's say you have some dermal papillae here that go like this, and we draw some epidermis on top of it like that. Well, you might think that if there are bumps here, we're going to see those bumps translate into some ridges of the epidermis. It usually isn't shown on the images, that you see, but they're there. So what we talk about is a fingerprint is just a pattern of these ridges, sometimes called friction ridges, on human fingertips. And they're formed by deeper patterns from these dermal or papillary ridges. So think about that. We have these waves of the dermis. These will translate into waves of the epidermis, and they'll form these clusters and these patterns that we call fingerprints, unique to each person. There have been even studies done between identical twins, and while their fingerprint patterns are very close, they're still not exactly the same. They are unique to every individual. So what is the function of these things? Well, it says here in green, they increase sensation of fine texture, and they aid in holding on to surfaces, gripping surfaces, especially when they are wet. So there is more function to them than just looking cool and a piece of architecture like you see here, or identifying criminals based on their fingerprints. Okay, really good picture here showing a lot of different things going on in the dermis. So at this point, the epidermis is almost too easy to talk about, but we can put an E here and say there is the epidermis, and the D here would be the biggest, thickest portion of the skin block called the dermis. And then the jelly beans, once you get down there, remember that's the hypodermal area. We'll make a very quick note of that at the very end here. But I can see lots of things in this picture. I see hair, I see glands, I see more balloons, like a big yellow balloon here, but it doesn't go all the way up where the Meissner's corpuscle was. So we see a lot of what we call accessory structures here in this skin block. So the reticular layer is the main portion here. We're talking about here, the top part is the papillary layer, and then this part of the dermis is the reticular layers. So it's usually a dense type of connective tissue. It may be regular and may be irregular. It provides 80% of the thickness of the dermis. That is a fact you see on a lot of standardized tests. It doesn't form 80% the thickness of the entire skin, but it's close because it's most of the dermis, and the dermis is most of the skin. Elastic fibers are found within, although they're usually never shown in pictures. But just think about it. You can grab your skin and pull it and then let go of it, and it should stretch out and then snap back into position once you've done this. Collagen fibers, of course, provide the strength, so you can pull on it, and it won't come ripping off, thank goodness. And then these accessory structures, the hair and the muscles and the vascular business, the nervous business, the sweat glands, oil glands, all this stuff are called accessory structures. And even the balloon I showed you a minute ago, which we know are called corpuscles, this one's a Pacinian corpuscle. If the Meissner's corpuscles were found in the papillary layer, the Pacinian corpuscles are found deeper in the reticular layer, and that gives you a sense of their function to provide deep sensation of touch more than light sensation of touch. Sometimes you see the Pacinian corpuscles giving you vibrational sensation too. Okay, let's take a peek at some of these accessory structures. Again, most of them originate from the epidermis, and this can be a trick question on some exams. Embryologically, when you're an embryo, these structures begin in the epidermis, and they kind of push down into the dermis, and some of them even are pushed down into the hypodermal areas, but they have an epidermal origin. These would be your sweat glands, your oil glands, hair, and your fingernails and toenails. Eccrine sweat glands. Eccrine. I can draw a circle around one right here. They're very easy to spot because simply the tube or the duct goes all the way to the top of the skin. There is no hair follicle associated with an eccrine gland, and that's the easiest way to spot them is tube to the top, and that's the trick that I would always give my class. If you see the tube to the top, no hair involved, it's an eccrine sweat gland. These are true sweat glands, true merocrine sweat glands that excrete sweat, which is salt and wastes and water. Yes, we know the sweat has a thermoregulatory function, that is, it helps cool the body by evaporative cooling. These sweat glands are active from birth, meaning from day one you have sweat glands, and a little bitty baby is able to sweat just fine. A little bitty baby does not need to attract a mate, so it's not going to have the other glands online yet, but it does have these online from birth. Again, the trick here, and I've put the tricks in purple, tube to the top. The duct that leads straight to the surface of the epidermis is the key for the eccrine sweat gland. So sudoriferous, anytime you see the word sudoriferous, it means it produces an odor, some kind of a smell. Now, it is arguable whether humans produce pheromones or not, as you would hear an animal produce pheromones. It's an argument that happens occasionally out there between people who talk about such things. Yes, they definitely are sexual scent glands that come online puberty and post-pubertal. So from the onset, again, onset means beginning. So from the beginning of puberty all the way through, and then from that point forward, you will have these sexual scent glands become active, mainly to attract a mate, right? So the problem here is these aren't shown very well on pictures, and I've never quite figured out why. So I'm going to kind of sketch one out for you to help you. It's hard to find good images of this. Remember, draw a wavy line so we can distinguish between the epidermis and the dermis. So I need a hair follicle for this. So I'm going to kind of draw a hair in there, even though I haven't talked about them yet. And if I were to draw an apocrine sweat gland, I would put it out here, offset from the hair. It's usually quite large. Remember how the eccrine had a tube going straight to the top? This is not an eccrine gland, so we can't have a tube to the top. The duct in this case will bend over and will attach to the hair. And then any secretions that come out of this gland that move through the duct will come out through the hair follicle. So apocrine glands are offset from the hair, but they often have a duct that leads over to the hair. And for whatever reason, they're left off of a lot of pictures, and I find that strange, but true. We find these where we find a lot of hair growth post-pubertal, the axillary, the armpit region, and the anogenital regions, which should make sense upon hearing the term. Are these sexual scent glands? 100%. Could they be responsible for strange sexual phenomena like the McClintock effect? Probably so. Again, what is the McClintock effect? If you ever heard of a group of women living together, say at a college dorm, and all of their menstrual cycles or periods become synced up with each other, this is called the McClintock effect. Now, again, there's some argument on whether or not this actually occurs, but there is a lot of evidence that shows that it does. And the evidence does show that the apocrine glands, these sexual scent glands, have something to do with the timing. And you can kind of think about in a tribal setting a long time ago when humans lived in tribes, it would make sense if the men go off hunting and they're gone for perhaps a couple of weeks at a time. When they come back, that the menstrual cycles of the women in the tribe are all timed together so we could have mating in between the hunting cycles. Does that make sense to you? So a lot of information there, but just think of an apocrine gland as a sexual scent gland. Ceruminous glands are specialized apocrine glands, and strangely enough, I don't see any good pictures of these in textbooks either, so I'm going to have to sketch one in here. So a ceruminous gland produces something called cerumen, and in red here, I'm going to show where you would find them. You'd find it like right here, and then you'd have a duct leading down to this big tunnel, your ear hole, right, where you stick your Q-tip even though you're not supposed to. And you'd find other ones too, maybe down here. It's probably not the best picture of where it could go, but they look something like that. And they're embedded in this fatty tissue, and they secrete cerumen into this tunnel. Now this tunnel is called the EAM, external auditory meatus. That's the fancy term for that ear canal. So why does it do this? Why do we have glands that produce a waxy substance? And it is a waxy lipid. Well, it's to trap dust or insects that may enter your ear. And you say, well, insects don't enter my ear. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But if they don't, you're probably lucky enough to sleep on a bed. You have to remember that a lot of people in the world, a lot of people in the world, millions, just sleep on a pallet on the floor. And if you're going to do this, bugs will try to crawl into your ear. So if you do have some earwax to trap them, that would be good. And that's what the evolutionary pressure is for the cerumen. Now, of course, in a modern society, we think, ooh, gross, get this earwax out of my ear as fast as I can. But it actually does have some function evolutionarily. So we do have some ducts, I said, that enter into this EAM, the exterior auditory meatus, something we'll learn about more when we get to the bone structures. Okay, a mammary gland found in breast tissue of both males and females, by the way. And of course, you see the picture of the breast tissue over here and the collection of mammary glands that lead out to the nipple. So these are specialized apocrine glands responsible for lacturea, that is producing a milk-like substance, and true lactation, that is producing enough of this milky substance to feed a baby. There's a difference between lacturea, just kind of a leaking out, and a lactation, which is a flowing of the milk. These are well developed in females, of course, and this is due to a hormone being present called prolactin. So if you have an elevated level of prolactin, you will be prone to creating more lactative mammary glands. Now, you may have heard men having the ability to lactate. This is kind of something fun to put on the internet. Yes, males do have these mammary glands, although they are very rudimentary. You'll never ever be able to feed a child through male lactation. And they don't even secrete the correct product. It's called galacturea. And again, it could be an oozing of a milk-like product, especially when you're around, say, hormones of your partner, and you could produce these, but it's never enough to feed a baby at all. Okay, sebaceous glands. These are shown. I'll try to draw them or circle them right here. Really good image of a sebaceous gland. Notice how it's kind of glued onto the hair. And that's what they look like. They look like these glands that are stuck onto the hair. They're not offset like an apocrine gland would be. They're stuck to it. So sebaceous glands are oil glands. They're not called sweat glands technically. They're called oil glands. And these are other glands that turn online once you begin puberty and then post-pubertal as well. So these grow directly from the hair follicles. That's why they look like they're stuck on there or glued on there, because they've grown directly from it. And they will secrete a substance called sebum. That's why they're called sebaceous glands. They make a substance called sebum. Sebum, in its simplest form, is an antibacterial oily substance. And you secrete it into the hair. It moves up through the hair follicle onto the surface of the skin and prevents foreign bacteria from growing on your skin. It's also one of these things where, you touch your arm, you touch your face, you rub your hair, and you're doing this all day, even though you may not realize you're doing it. You're rubbing this oil, you're rubbing this sebum across your body and on your hair. And this gives you soft, shiny hair and skin. You say, why would that be so important? Well, when it comes to mate selection, evolutionarily, when you're trying to choose a mate, you hopefully want to choose a mate who's healthy, because a healthy mate is a sign that they will produce healthy offspring. And that's the whole point of reproduction, right? So sometimes, though, especially around puberty, when these glands come online, they can produce so much sebum that they clog up the hair ducts and they clog up their own sebaceous ducts. And you may get these raised areas on the surface of your skin, kind of like this. Little bumps. And these are called pustules. Most people refer to them as zits, right? And this is something called acne. The technical term is called acne vulgaris, which many people have, beginning at puberty, and it kind of goes away as you get older, but you never ever are free from having zits. They will appear the rest of your life. Okay, we've moved all the way through the dermis now. Now we're down here to this very bottom jelly bean layer, the layer that's under the dermis, called the hypodermis. And that's primarily what it is fatty fat cells, adipose cells. So when you think hypodermis, immediately think of fat being stored underneath the dermis. This will thicken as you get older, and inevitably will start to sag down because of the influence of gravity. So a lot of older people have this sagging skin because their hypodermal area has increased in thickness. Functions of the hypodermis, of course, if you see adipose tissue, you know it has to do with fats and storing fats for energy, but it also gives you some connection to the dermis that's above it and connection to muscles and bones that might be below it. Insulation for when the winter months come. If you have more hypodermal fat stored, you are protected from the colder temperatures better. And of course, some cushioning. It also helps to make women look a little bit more rounder and curvier, and women do put more fat in this hypodermal area than men do. Alright, did you enjoy that one? If you did, thanks for watching. Check out the other videos in the series if you wish to, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.